Good evening again. I think with that teaser, we can get to a very important conversation. As that video indicated, we are talking about mobilizing natural capital. My name is Wole Famurewa. I'm delighted to be moderating this session. Thank you so much for sticking with us for the late shift, but we do believe that this is a very important conversation and hopefully it will be valuable to you. And as indicated in that short clip, Africa indeed has a challenge on its hands. It needs to find a healthy balance between transitioning, if you like, to non-carbon energy sources and also at the same time improving overall access to energy. So today we're going to talk a bit about leveraging climate finance to support development of climate smart infrastructure. We're going to discuss everything from the financing gap. We're going to talk about the opportunities for new financing and then also identify climate smart approaches in key sectors and industries. So to get us started, I'd like to now invite to deliver a brief opening remark along these lines, the President of the Africa Finance Corporation. Please put your hands together as he steps to the podium, Mr. Samaila Zubairu. Can we clap for him as he comes? Thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I'd like to thank the African Development Bank and our partners in the African Investment Forum for this opportunity. So we just watched that short clip, and that kind of sets the scene for us. So, good evening again, distinguished guests. As we are now less than a week away from COP27, the first COP on African soil since 2016, it is paramount that we in the investment community articulate a clear vision of what we all can do to propel Africa's role in the race to global net zero. So let's begin. What's our role? I think it's good to set a little context here. The recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with the result of the research they've undertaken, and the results were quite stark. It led the UN Secretary General to say that there has been no action taken and that we're on a path to an unlivable world, and that what we have is a litany of broken promises on climate. So that's really what we're dealing with. And we all know that in this big crisis that the world is about to embark upon, Africa is the least contributor to carbon emissions. Specifically, the average person in Africa uses 180 kilowatts of electricity per hour. That is less than 3% of the 6,500 kilowatts per hour consumed by the average European, and just about 1.3% of the 13,000 kilowatts per hour per American. Therefore, unlike other regions, we cannot reduce power consumption. But that is not to say that Africa doesn't have a role to play in cutting harmful emissions. In fact, we have a major role to play. Why? 4 out of every 5 persons in sub-Saharan Africa use firewood, charcoal, or kerosene to cook. These fuels produce black carbon, which contributes to more than 500,000 premature deaths every year, as well as stunted growth and increased risk of respiratory infections in children under 5. Population growth means problems from this cooking fuel will only get worse. Providing cleaner fuel for cooking reduces harmful emissions, as well as reducing the race to global net zero for Africa. Essentially, preserving our forests is a key responsibility for the entire globe. Why? We know that African forests absorb about 1,500 tons of 1,500 billion tons of carbon dioxide. So essentially in Africa, we've been absorbing carbon emissions for centuries. And because emissions have no borders, carbon emissions in America, in Europe, in Russia, they are absorbed in Africa and in every other tropical forest around the world. So preserving our forests is a responsibility for the world. People having to chop trees to cook is the key reason why Africa has the world's fastest rate of forest depletion, which means deforestation. Right now, our tropical and montane forests absorb carbon emissions equivalent to the emissions from 320 million cars. Essentially, the forests in Africa absorb the emissions of literally all the cars in the US and more. Therefore, we must work with the global community to protect these carbon sinks by assigning realizable economic value to preserving our forests. We must also encourage African leaders to stop selling cheap carbon credits or giving rights to people to buy carbon credits in future for a price that is so low today, especially because we know the amount that is spent on carbon capture and storage. If we look at the two, we know that we're selling forests cheap, and we should stop doing that. A past, even more significant contribution for net zero is a reduction of global shipping. If the global shipping was a country, it would be the 6th largest greenhouse emitter after China, US, India, Russia, and Japan. Reducing shipping requires a complete rethink of the way African economies have operated for centuries. Essentially, our current practice of just producing raw materials for export and processing in other parts of the world and shipment to other parts of the world, including back to Africa, is what we must change. This is the reason why structural transformation has not occurred on the continent. It's the reason why we have several cycles of boom and bust. When commodity prices do well, we all do well, and anytime there's volatility, we all suffer. We have currency depreciation, we have devaluation, we have high public debt, as we're experiencing now in most other African countries. Rather than exploiting our natural resources to Asia for processing only to import them as finished goods, we must invest in local production and processing in Africa. This includes the minerals and metals necessary to achieve the global energy transition. This is an important point to note. I was talking to a group earlier in the day, and I was trying to make them imagine the scale of minerals and metals that will be required going forward. If you think about it, an electric car requires 6 times more minerals and metals than an internal combustion engine car, which we use normally today. A gas turbine and a wind turbine, if you compare the amount of minerals and metals that goes into each, a wind turbine requires 11 times more minerals and metals than a gas turbine. So just imagine the transition that we are all embarked upon, and the fact that we need to replace gas turbines with wind turbines, we need to replace internal combustion engine cars with electric cars. Right now, I think we have about 8 million electric cars. We're projected to have 100 million, rising to 300 million in future. So just imagine the scale of minerals and metals that will be required for that transition to take place. And imagine the amount of mining that will be required. It can't be that we're going to ship all of those to Asia for processing and then to the rest of the world. That's not viable. We will never achieve net zero with that kind of business model. So this is the way we have to rethink how we operate in the world today. And it turns out that this is the opportunity that Africa needs to achieve structural transformation going forward. Ending Africa's economies away from primary resource export towards secondary and tertiary industries is the most effective way to align our continent with global net zero without sacrificing economic growth. This is why we have recently published a white paper called Roadmap to Africa's COP, a pragmatic path to net zero. Here we're arguing and advocating for the world, especially African leaders, to have consensus on the pathway for Africa towards net zero, and for the world at large as well towards net zero. I urge you all to read that paper. where we prescribe local manufacturing as the first of 3 significant areas of change that are required for achieving net zero. These priorities include localizing industry on the continent, and for that, it means that we do processing on the continent, which is the reason why we have always embarked on how can we have more value capture on the continent. We have invested in special economic zones, in industrial parks across the continent. They've been successful. They've created jobs. They've increased exports. They've allowed for foreign companies to come and locate in Africa, essentially improving prosperity. We think we need to do that at scale, and such initiatives is what will help achieve net zero going forward. It's also what will help develop the African continent. It has been so successful that we are replicating the same model in Benin, in Togo, and tomorrow, inshallah, in Nigeria, we shall be commissioning a few projects in Ogun State towards that effect, and we have several of such in the Republic of Chad, Republic of Congo, here in Côte d'Ivoire, as well as in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So, the industrial zone that we have has been certified as the first carbon-free industrial zone in the world. This is our Gabon Special Economic Zone. This is important because we're showing that even when we do the local processing in Africa, we can do it in a clean, sustainable way. So the way to go is for us to have a lot more of these industrial activities in Africa. Why? Because in Africa, we have a variety of renewable sources of energy that we can use. We can use hydro, we can use wind, we can use solar. But especially, our industrial zone relies mainly on hydropower. So SGS has certified it as the first carbon neutral industrial zone in the world as we speak, which is the reason why we are replicating this investment across the continent. The second focus for us is on rebuilding infrastructure. Africa is significantly coastal. We are currently suffering the most devastating impacts of climate change. Our infrastructure was not built to withstand the effects of climate. So we need to rebuild this infrastructure. We need to climate-proof Africa's infrastructure in a way that they can withstand the effects of climate change. In the same report I referred to earlier, it has been declared that if we don't take action in climate-proofing infrastructure, the loss caused by structural damage is going to increase to 415 billion by the year 2030, up from about 220 billion currently. Africa's economy, about 35% is at risk to climate change. We need to reverse this by climate-proofing infrastructure on the continent. This is why we are launching an infrastructure climate resilience fund that seeks to raise capital, from several parts of the world using the blended finance model to climate-proof infrastructure on the continent. One third area of importance, as we set out in our paper, is financial innovation. This is how we can work together to raise the capital and convert the various pledges that have been made for investment. Essentially, we're arguing that we need to move from aid, we need to repurpose aid budgets for insurance and guarantees in a way that we can use that to mobilize additional capital. This is also a way of managing Africa's prejudice premium. We all know that the perception of risk in Africa is inflated, and that empirical studies by international rating agencies show that Africa has the lowest default rate in infrastructure. At the press briefing earlier today, the president mentioned those. I don't want to repeat them here, but it's empirical evidence. We are not as risky, but we're paying so much more. A way to manage this is using blended finance, using non-payment insurance to reduce all of this risk. So while we're arguing for change, we've also done our part. We've done our part by building renewable assets across the continent. We built the first wind farm in Cape Verde, provides 20% of the energy requirements of the island. We're building a hydro dam here in Côte d'Ivoire that will reduce electricity tariffs significantly. We're building a wind farm in Djibouti as well that will replace imported fuel from Ethiopia. We have invested in the largest renewable company in Africa with over 1,000 megawatts, and we have a pipeline of increasing that. We have projects in Senegal, in Nigeria, in Mali, in Egypt, in South Africa. Now, the thing to note is that Africa has 60% of the best solar sources globally, yet less than 1% is built. At the same time, Africa has 5,000 billion cubic meters of natural gas, which the International Energy Association says that if we develop all of the natural gas that we have for the next 30 years, we would only increase our emissions from 3 to 3.5%. So that shows that we must continue to develop natural gas as a transition fuel. We must continue to see how we can invest in industry and prosperity for our people. I want to stop here. I thank you all for listening. Thank you very much.
Can we please give him another round of applause as he steps down? I think he has, with palpable energy and conviction, communicated the high stakes, and he has also suggested real solutions that we can use as we transit to much more sustainable and cleaner energy sources. I'd like to now invite my panelists as we interrogate this subject further to the stage, starting with Loic Ewia. He's the head business development at Gridlock Partners. Loic, please put your hands together for him as he steps forward. Thank you very much. Gridworks was established in 2019 as a dedicated platform for development and investment in Africa's electricity networks. They invest in transmission, distribution, and distributed renewable energy. Loic, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you. We also have joining us for this session, Linda Mabhena Olagunju. She is the founder and CEO of DLO Energy Resources. A round of applause for her as she steps forward. Thank you. DLO Energy Resources Group is an independent power producer headquartered in Johannesburg, South Africa, with primary operations in renewable energy, solar power, and wind power. We also have joining us for this session, and I do believe he will be on stage with us very shortly, Katan Hirachang, Head Origination and Advisory at Societe Generale. I do understand he's making his way here, so I do believe once he's here, he will join us on the stage. So on that note, I'd like to join my panelists as we get started. By the way, I wanted to suggest, depending on how this flows, we'd like to open this up to the audience. So if you do have thoughts to share, to chime in as we interrogate this conversation, very important conversation, we would give you the opportunity to do so. Maybe we can take one or two questions before we're done. So Loic, thanks again for being part of this. Let's start with you. Mr. Zubairu has communicated the urgency of addressing the climate challenge on the African continent. So as we transit, I want you to perhaps, first of all, share your experience at Gridlocks and just give us a sense of what you're seeing in terms of the opportunity to deploy finance to green energy on the continent. Let's start with that. Maybe you can just wrap that up for us. Share your experience very briefly.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the question. Just to give a bit of context about Gridworks, Gridworks is a development and investment platform in Africa electricity network. So we focused on investing in transmission distribution, both in and on and off grid. Coming back to your question regarding the transition has started. There have been significant investments in renewable-based generation over the years. and this is positive. But we need to highlight few facts. Most of the countries and other continents that are chasing net zero benefit from solid grid, and they have slower demand. So the way the energy transition is fought from their perspective is more around displacing thermal generation. When we look at Africa, when we look at in terms of energy intensity, we are increasing the means of production, that's good, but we also need to look at what's happening downstream. So the network are under-penetrated, and the challenge will be not just on the generation side, but to ensure that this energy which is produced effectively reach the consumers.
Right.
So it's distributed without losses and also without any depletion that you may have. So as we're looking at the transition in Africa, particularly on the energy side, if we want to industrialize, if we want to provide access, we need to invest heavily in network. And networks at the moment have not attracted the same amount of capital than generation has done.
You're speaking about transmission networks now.
Transmission and distribution networks have not attracted the same amount of capital that generation has. And we think that this is the gap. If we need to succeed in that transition, but also if we need to succeed in that transition while having a strong industrialization and access to people, we need to invest in networks.
Right, thank you for that. Linda, same question for you. Sharing your experience, how do you see Africa's transition going? Just share your perspective.
Thank you. I think a lot of focus has been placed on the just energy transition without much detail into how it's all going to operate. So in South Africa, as an example, we're in the process of finalizing our deal ahead of COP27, and donor nations have given about $8.5 billion. The actual need is 5 times that amount, it's $46.5 billion. No one seems to be talking about how Africa is going to plug that funding gap. And it's a very important discussion because, we emit quite a bit, less than 3%, and it seems to me we're going to be left carrying the bag as far as the debt of this just energy transition. The second layer to the discussion for me is we need to be realistic with our continent. The Honorable Finance Minister spoke earlier about the fact that we have been in a rainy season for over 5 years on the continent, and it's set to continue. I think over and above a climate change crisis, we have an unemployment crisis. And we need to then unpack the jobs created by the renewable energy space vis-a-vis traditional fossil fuel systems. So no one denies the fact that climate change is important, but we need to actually understand how it's all going to materialize economically.
Very important point. Thank you so much. Lloyd, coming back to you now. Africa obviously needs to attract a lot more capital, just as Linda has mentioned. So what's the, in your view, innovative thinking around that? Is it in the products? Is it in the partnerships? How exactly do you think we can attract a lot more climate finance?
Maybe let's start by the way we're thinking about those investments. I mentioned the gap in networks investment. Networks investment are important because that's how you distribute that energy, and that's how you distribute that electron, whether it's green electron or not. But if it's green, it's better, but it needs to be transported, it needs to reach people, it needs to reach industries. So as we're thinking about that, there is a growing recognition that the SDGs about access, and access to energy cannot be achieved without investment in that space. So if we're saying that investment in transmission favor the climate, then we need to recognize that it is an asset class that is investable and that should attract capital. Donors and DFIs have done a lot supporting the states doing that, but they need to do so. But the investment needs are important, so private sector needs to be invited. If for private sector to come, there needs to be sustainable business model and enabling environment. So if we recognize that investing in transmission is green financing, we need to provide an enabling environment so that that capital can come and complement the existing source of funding for the sector. It has been done in the most advanced economies. It has been done in Latin America. It has been done in India. It has to be done in Africa. And we need to coalesce all of this funding so that we make sure that networks operate efficiently, can reach customer, and then we can reach access.
It's a very important point you're making, and I can certainly relate with that, because in Nigeria, for example, what we find is that the generation companies, in quotes, you can say are doing relatively well compared to the distribution companies. And a big challenge in that country is the transmission grid. There isn't enough investment going into that. And many will argue that one of the reasons for that is that the government had taken a decision to manage that bit of the value chain as opposed to privatizing it, for example. So in your view, in terms of cracking that challenge about networks, I wanted to hear your thoughts about policy making around that.
That's a good example, and it's all come back to sustainable business model. Sustainable business model, what does it mean? It means that whether you're a private or a public company, you need to have a regulatory environment which is stable. Yeah. You also need to have a mechanism through which you are able to have tariffs that move along so that you cover the cost. At the moment, let's say 95% of the utilities company in Africa can't cover the costs. Why? Because sometimes the tariffs are not where they should be, or the environment change, so you're not able to make the investment that you have so that you can break even and cover your costs. So it's a coalition of things. So if we recognize that we put in place an environment where there is clear policy direction about what we want to do for the sectors, clear rules, then you can have that, attract that capital and give investor confidence to do so. Let me give you a practical example. We at GridWorks are doing one project in Uganda at the moment. That's the first privately financed transmission project that we've announced a couple of months ago. But it is a project where we are upgrading 4 substations. So that's allowed the transit of electricity that were constrained. When you look at the country, there have been enough generation. They have, on the generation side, the investment have been made. Now we need to ensure that that capacity flows to industries and to consumer. As you do so in the electricity sector, the electricity is more used, you are at the time able to reduce the tariff, especially if you have a renewable base, in that instance, hydro. So if you have good planning and a good enabling environment, you can have a mix of private and public capital to invest in each part of your sectors, but you need to ensure that delivery. So that enabling environment helps you provide guidance for your sector as you go forward, and that is key.
Right, thank you for that. Linda, same question again to you in terms of, from the type of projects that you've been associated with, what's the innovative thinking around attracting more capital financing to renewable projects, green projects?
I think the key thing for any investor or donor country, if you look at it that way, is the primary objective is to also get business for their own companies, right? So you're not seeing these governments investing in Africa for nothing. They definitely want to make sure that their companies, their IPPs, are getting a piece of the action in Africa as well. So in order to attract investment, you need a clear regulatory policy that doesn't have a stop and start approach. Again, I'll use the examples of South Africa and Nigeria. I think Nigeria, I'll start there. We have looked at Nigeria since 2010, and we have looked at projects which seemed to be going somewhere. Light Up Lagos was one of them. I see it's being rebirthed again. And the challenges always are reaching financial close because the buyer, the off-taker, is not bankable. It starts with a government commitment to actually making the program work. What worked in South Africa is that our national treasury stands behind Eskom. As we all know, Eskom, which is our power utility, has been going through a lot of financial challenges. And what attracts investors still to South Africa is the reliability of the fact that investors are going to get paid. No investor will come where there's a risk of not getting paid. But given the fact that South Africa once had a strong renewable energy program and where we sit today, it speaks to what I'm talking about with the start-stop approach, because for a few period of 5 years, we had no activity in the market. Just last year, we awarded around 5 under the REAP program. Those projects still have not closed. That gives you an indication that there is challenges in doing projects sometimes on the continent because of the stop and start approach. And for me, investors want a plan. You can't come into a country for 1,000 megawatts. You want to know what the pipeline is going to look like for the foreseeable future. Investors want to participate in the different parts of the value chain of the energy system. So manufacturing, a lot of manufacturing plants closed in South Africa as a result of the delays in the program. The same thing, people came to Nigeria to invest and walked away.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I think that's very valuable insight into the real challenges that investors face on the African continent. Lloyd, coming back to you, I want you to now begin to give us a sense of what products can be deployed by companies like yours, like companies like Linda's, that can work in Africa. Because she has already stated all the challenges that she has faced doing business in Nigeria and South Africa. Is there a way we can perhaps add some support from, say, DFIs in making some of these projects work better? Is there a way we can collaborate with government or quasi-government institutions that can, to some extent, de-risk or mitigate risk relating to this? I just want to hear your thoughts about the creative thinking around that, and perhaps you have seen models that have worked.
Thank you. I think, coming back again to what I said, but just briefly to put in context, enabling environment is key, so that you can create a clear regulatory framework and set of rules that give confidence. Then I can give you 2 examples. The first example is when you think about transmission and distribution. If you invest in generation, you want to make sure that you paid. So you can look at various products, but unless you improve the efficiency of that power being actually used, that's how you reduce the risk. So we've heard sometimes things about risk mitigation, but the first risk mitigation is to ensure that that electricity is used and paid for. That's where investment in network, as we're doing in Uganda, as we're also pushing private sector also to come in, and the government, we're seeing increasingly in our discussion with the government a lot of pipeline and opportunity to do so. So you can bring that private and capital alongside donors and DFIs. DFIs also need to do more to make available to the government the array from concessional debt with multilateral DFI funding, private sector funding. Everybody have to push into the same direction. They have supported the sector, they should continue to do so, but there's no point generating green electron if you're not going to use it, if I put it this way. The third part is also about access. We have a project that we are doing in Eastern DRC. It's called the Moi Power Project. It is what we call, some may call it mini-grid, but it's not a mini-grid. These are utilities where we're building greenfield generation, distribution, and commercialization for people in 3 cities, Iziro, Gemena, and Bumba, that represents 500,000 people, and we'll be investing for 25 years. So what we are doing at the moment is we're using a blend of capital, our capital, alongside some of our co-sponsors, to invest equity in the project. We'll be using long-term DFI debt, but we will also be catalyzing a share of grant so that we make sure that the investment and the tariff is affordable for the population. So in terms of when you're looking at that piece of that part where it's about access and distribution, you want to do it at scale. That's what we do in MoiPower, but you want to coalesce these three sources of funding. And that's what we're doing, and that's the innovation. And we want to do more, and there is the opportunity to do more. That's what we call sustainable business model. And that's why, from our perspective, we need to gather everybody to understand that if we want to meet these SDGs, we also need to ensure that there is sustainability operationally, but also scale and path to, yes.
But in terms of applying that blended financing that you just spoke of, and what we want to see is more success like what you've seen at the DRC, what typically do you think could be the deal breaker in terms of making all of that work? Typically, these projects have an element of public and private sector partnership. I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that and what we can learn from your experience.
The reason why we like this project and we want to replicate it, because it has certain features that help build the case for sustainability. There is scale. So we're talking about powering 500,000 people initially, and that population will grow over 25 years. But that means that you have scale for doing your operation, and at some point you need to break even, you need volume. The second part is also a strong regulatory framework. That means that you have a concession contract that allows for clear rules about the apportionment of risk. Yeah. And these are the set of features that give confidence to DFIs, that give confidence to sponsors and developers like us, but also because of the impact element, we are able to attract that funding. So it all comes down to sustainable business model and clear regulatory environment and rules.
So the regulatory environment is key.
Yes.
All right, Linda, coming back to you, and if we can be a little more creative, if you like, by going to the existing power companies, we want to see that transition. And if they're already invested in these businesses, then potentially they are a source of financing. So your thoughts about incentivizing existing power companies to actually make this transition, what do you think, what are the elements that can make that work?
You mean companies that are operating on fossil-based
exactly.
Fuels? So about 2 weeks ago, Eskom decommissioned a coal-powered plant in South Africa to turn it into a renewable energy plant. It was an extensive consultative basis. There was a lot of consultation with labor to see how everything was going to pan out. So they have managed to retain, for example, the staff. But the key critical thing that remains for me is that coal-powered plant contributed to a wider value chain. So there were companies that supply the coal, the companies that transport the coal. There's businesses that are adding to this value chain. So when we talk about the clean energy transition, people tend to look at the power plant and keeping the labor that's there and retaining it. But no one speaks about the ancillary businesses that are going to lose out as a result of the conversion. Yeah. And I say so because there isn't an upskilling that is taking place. So coal contributes again 5% to our GDP in South Africa. How is that going to be plugged? We haven't really thought about these things. It's not enough to just say, oh, we've retained the people in this power plant. What about the small businesses that have been killed as a result? The oil and gas sector in Nigeria is the same. It accounts for a significant amount of your GDP. Sure. How is that transition going to impact that economic growth? But I'm not saying, obviously, that climate change isn't real and that the transition mustn't happen. I'm just saying that a lot more thought a lot more planning needs to happen. And not to just point out the problems. For me, the solutions are around making sure there's an element of localization in this approach. Most of those turbines are manufactured in China, manufactured outside of our continent, and imported in. So how do we support manufacturing on the continent? I'd like to also go back to your first question to Loic, where you asked about the role of DFIs.
Yes.
The role of DFIs for me is critical. They need to cut the time in which they take to close deals. And I'll give you a primary example, a practical one. We bought what was the largest exporter of panel manufacturers for substations in South Africa. We own that company. It's taken us, with our track record, 2 years to reach financial close. And even though we've reached financial close with this DFI, it's taken us another 6 months to get to drawdown. That's not practical. That's killing business. And I think DFIs need to equip their staff to be mindful of these things, cut down times, cut down processes, react more favorably to business. The opposite, for example, with the wind farm. We have a wind farm where the capex was 5 billion rand. We were able to raise that in 6 months, close that deal within a 6-month period. And because it was being led by a commercial bank, we need to get our DFIs to the level of commercial banks. The last point I want to put on the DFI matter is DFIs are sitting with a lot of capital. None of that is being deployed to early stage development. And by that I mean, well, some of it is, but not enough. By that I mean creating African-owned power companies that are developing these projects. The vast majority of renewable energy projects on this continent are foreign-owned. And those companies then leave the continent. You're not creating then locally owned companies that invest more in their countries and build more in their communities. So we need to see how we get more of a bigger participation from African-owned development companies.
I think that's a very important point. And actually, I think it deserves a round of applause. Because as we continue to deal with the issues in Africa, I think one thing is clear. Africa needs to solve its problems. And the more we invest in African institutions, African companies, African entrepreneurs, then we have a better chance at dealing with these things long term. But coming back to you, Loic, do you want to share some point? Do you want to chime in on that point as well?
Yes, I think the point, the approach is really around how the company are involved in that early stage development as well. There's also one way to look at, as we're looking at the energy sector and the transition, is the affordability of power. Coming back to the point regarding manufacturing, how can you manufacture or be competitive on the manufacturing side if you don't have available, reliable, and affordable electricity? Because it's one element which is an input in your competitivity. So as we're thinking about industries, again, power availability and access is important. To industries, it's paramount, but that means that we need also not just thinking about that generation, but thinking about how we look at the whole value chain so that people can have, that power can be a driver for economic growth.
I think you've also touched another very important point, and that is, and it may be a controversial question, is renewable power affordable in Africa? Can it be deployed in an affordable manner? How would you answer that question, Linda?
Well, most definitely from a power generation side. I mean, studies have been done. Wind plants, for example, are 40% cheaper than new coal build, right? So affordability from a price point has come down over the years. The price of solar panels have come down. The competitive bidding processes have made renewables, more affordable, especially where there is an established market. So in South Africa, for example, our tariffs
So
are...
is that the condition? There has to be an established market for it to work?
There has to be, because if you are doing a start and stop approach, there isn't... So for example, if you don't have a government-backed program, there's more risk that you are assuming, right? If government isn't standing behind, or a reliable off-taker isn't standing behind that, an investor is going to obviously calculate into the tariff the risk that they are taking. What makes South Africa affordable, and Morocco and Egypt and other countries on the continent, is because they have that reliable regulatory policy to an extent. But we also have to be careful. I think as Africans, we have become very used to cheap electricity, and we see it as our democratic right. And we are seeing in Europe right now electricity pricing escalating. And to some points, I don't think necessarily we pay what the price of electricity should be in certain instances. And it also leads to us wasting. So I think we need to respect electricity in that sense. But and so far as saying, are renewables cheaper? They definitely are, they can be. It just requires that reliable government policy to make investors be able to compete on a more competitive pricing basis.
Any thoughts on that point too?
I think it's a good question, but that has to be put in perspective. Because when you look at the price of electricity, which is delivered to end user, generation is only one part of that. You have also transmission and distribution. And as also I mentioned previously that most of the company cannot cover the costs. Maybe it was a polite way to say that there is an issue about bankability, coming back to that. So what that means is generation is not the only component. When you have losses in transmission, when you have losses in distribution, then that affects your cost of power. So it is true that there is a reflection that every power producer needs to make an arbitrage around the use of the technology, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it's only one portion of the end user tariff, and there are other aspects that needs to be reduced, I think, so that you can benefit from the scale that you're getting on renewable, because renewable is scaling, the price is falling. But that means that even if you put the cheapest form of generation on your network, but you still have high losses in transmission, in distribution, you're not creating sustainability, you will always have an issue with tariff. And I think that's where the gap is, that's where we need to focus our attention. That's our mandate as GridWorks, but that also means that when we will create sustainable company, when we will create sectors that are financially sustainable, that means that it will create the bankability element that will further facilitate the penetration of new generation and the penetration of new renewable.
In my mind, I think the question around the cost is perhaps more relevant in the context of discussing off-grid power. So perhaps as we begin to round up, maybe you can speak a little bit to that point about how we can still attract capital to off-grid solutions. Very briefly, if you can.
I think off-grid is good in a sense that it allows communities that don't have power to get connected to that power. We also need to, most of the off-grid companies have been funded through some sort of donor funding, and as they grew, that support from donors has to continue. But there is the issue of scale. Yeah. When you make a lot of connection, you need to service those connections. So if the intensity and the use of those areas that you've connected is not enough, that means that you will have high maintenance costs. So it may well be the case that to service these connections, you're losing money for each electron that you're selling. So there is a whole reflection around how do we create sustainabilities around that. Donor capital is good because that reduces the cost of capital, but we also need to think about scale so that you don't lose money for every megawatt hour or kilowatt hour that you're selling.
Yeah. Linda?
I like the role that we call it CNI, commercial and industrial power, has brought for me in the mix, because it's meant that power is decentralizing now in Africa. We're no longer looking to the utility alone to provide electricity. So a lot of large businesses are generating their own capacity, which helps take the load off state-owned utilities. But it also means that those state utilities are losing their biggest income generators, their biggest clients. And then it means those state utilities are underfunded, and an underfunded state utility means it's not able to perform and service the poor. So you're going to find that there are going to be very touchy-feely issues around electricity as we continue, this move towards decentralization of power. And it's going to destabilize a lot of, political dynamics. We're seeing it in South Africa. The community of Soweto in Johannesburg is switched off on power because they haven't paid their utility bills. They get load shedding in addition to what we have as a country as a whole. So I think governments tread carefully around the issue of power because they understand the need to supply power to the public at large. And what off-grid power does is it provides the opportunity for us to generate for ourselves, but it also takes away an income generation for the state utility, leading to more problems, I think.
You wanted to add something to that?
Just to continue on that thing, it is useful because at the moment there are a lot of industries that are relying on diesel generation. So being able to provide reliable power is good. The cheapest form of providing access and reliability is through the grid. This solution needs to be
always the first
needs to be balanced. I think
option. If we can find it, great.
I think if you look at the energy and if you look at the mapping on the African continent, if you look at versus the transmission spine versus Europe, France, other countries, you will see that that's the way over time to deliver the cheapest form of power. But it's not just about access, it's also about security and redundancy in the sector. What happens if you lose one substation? Do you have enough on the network so that you can divert that power to help? So all of these form of power, be it CNI is good. We need to look at it so that it creates attractive case for investors, but also trying to address some of the social issues. But it also have to be planned alongside the grid and alongside the intervention. That's why planning is important.
No doubt. We're almost out of time, but if we do have any questions or comments from the audience, we can take that now. If you can just raise up your hand. I know it's been a long day, but if you do have any questions, oh yes, we have one here. So please, can we have the microphone given to the gentleman? Please make it relatively brief, introduce yourself and ask yeah, that way. Yes, please keep your hands up until it gets to you, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this opportunity. So I'm going to keep it very short. My name is Dennis Matanda. I recently left the US government and I work to support Africa's development finance institutions and state-owned enterprises in the United States. So I listened to this conversation with such great interest from two very simple perspectives. In 2021, the United States private sector, private equity, venture capitalists raised over $399 billion. That money was raised for the very first time in the history of the United States. What I'm also saying is that, from the second perspective, is that over the next few years, the next 5 years, there's going to be a complete reduction of money. The ultimate objective is that listening to the two of you speak, Linda and Lloyd, and I'm not saying the moderator is not valuable, but just listening to the two of you speak, I think that you are selling to us, the converted. I'm just saying that if, for example, the Africa Investment Forum went on a roadshow to a city like Dallas, to a city like Chicago, I can bet you that there would be people, or so to speak from the energy perspective, of takers of the great opportunities that you have to offer. Thank you.
thank you. And who knows, we might be organizing that in the not so distant future. Do we have any other question or comment before we wrap this all up? It's been a long day and you've been a great audience. Please, can we put our hands together for our panelists? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I think on that note, we are done.